Hello, welcome to this lesson on multipliers. Now, people can do two things with their income. They can spend it or they can save it. The marginal propensity to consume, or MPC, is how much more people spend when they get more income. So it's the change in consumption, the change in spending divided by the change in disposable income. And the marginal propensity to save, or MPS, is how much more people save when they get more income. So that's going to be the change in savings divided by the change in disposable income. Now, see how MPC and MPS have to equal 1 because you can only do two things with 100% of your money. You can either spend it or save it. So here we have year A and year B, how much disposable income people have, how much spending, and how much saving they've done. We're going to look at the MPC first, which is going to be the change in consumption over the change in disposable income. So the new consumption, the new spending is 1,000 minus the old spending, which is 500. That gives us 500. The new disposable income is 1,500 minus the old disposable income, which is 1,000. That gives us 500, which ends up being 1. For the marginal propensity to save, we look at the change in spending over the change in disposable income. So the new spend, the new sorry, the change in savings over the change in disposable income. The new savings is 500 minus the old savings, which is 500. That gives us 0. The new disposable income is 1,500 minus the old disposable income, which is 1,000. That gives us 500. Now, 0 divided by 500 gives us 0, which means that the MPC is 1 and the MPS is 0. Another way I could have gotten this is, since MPC plus MPS must equal 1, if I knew the MPS, which in this case is 0, that would be 1 minus the MPS, which is 0, which gives me an MPC of 1. Here, if I knew the MPC, which is 1, that would give us 1 minus 1, which is an MPS of 0. So if you know the other one, you can do this one. It's a lot simpler. If you only know the change in savings or the change in consumption, you have to find this one first. This example means that people spent all of their marginal or additional income from year A to year B. How does spending impact the economy? Well, we can see the actual impact by looking at this. The total change in GDP equals the spending multiplier, which is how much spending is going to be multiplied in the economy, times an initial change in spending. And the spending multiplier is 1 over MPS. So let's do this example. If MPS is zero point 0.5 and the initial change in consumer spending is 500, an increase of 500, we're going to use the spending multiplier since it's talking about spending. That's 1 over MPS, or 1 over zero point 0.5, which is 2. So now the total change in GDP is going to equal the multiplier, which is 2, times a $500 increase. That's the initial change. That gives us a $1,000 increase in GDP. Let's look at another example. If the MPC is 0.75, the total change in GDP is an increase of $20. What was the initial change in government spending that was needed to achieve this GDP increase? So since it's talking about spending, we're going to use this spending multiplier right here, 1 over MPS. Now, we don't know MPS, but we know MPC, which is 0.75. So we can do 1 minus MPC to get an MPS of 0.25. We'll plug that here. 1 over 0.25 gives us a spending multiplier of 4. So we know the total change in GDP is an increase of $20. We know the multiplier is 4, so then we solve for this initial change by the government. That will mean that we are going to do 20 divided by 4, which means that the government increased government spending by $5. How do taxes and transfer payments impact the economy? Well, the total change in GDP is going to equal the taxes or transfers multiplier times the initial change in taxes or transfer payments. Now the taxes and transfer payment multiplier, they're the same. It's MPC or MPS for both taxes and transfer payments. Here's the example. If MPS is zero point 0.5 and the initial change in transfer payments is an increase of 500, well, since it's transfer payments, we're going to use the transfers multiplier, which is MPC over MPS. We know MPS is zero point 0.5, which means we can get MPC by subtracting that right there. 1 minus MPS gives us zero point 0.5. So zero point 0.5 over zero point 0.5 gives us a transfer multiplier of 1. So the total change in GDP is going to equal the multiplier, which is 1 times $500 increase, which is going to equal a $500 increase in GDP. In example 2, we have MPC is 0.75. The total change in GDP is $50 increase. What was the initial change in taxes that is needed to have achieved this GDP increase? Well, since it's talking about taxes, we're going to use the taxes multiplier right here, MPC over MPS. Now we know MPC is 0.75. If we subtract 1 minus MPC, that gives us an MPS of 0.25. So then we do MPC over MPS, that gives us 3. The total change in GDP was an increase of $50. The multiplier is 3, so we have to solve for this initial change in taxes from the government. So then you do 50 divided by 3 here, that gives you a $16.67 change in taxes. Now, since GDP is increasing, the government must have reduced taxes. So to reduce taxes, you increase GDP. So it's actually a decrease of $16.67 in taxes. Because to increase GDP, you decrease taxes. So now let's put it all together in this graph right here. So we're currently at point A, but we want to go to full employment output. That's the goal, to stabilize the economy, bring it back to full employment. So we have an output gap of 500. It's our current GDP minus 1,000. We have a negative $500 output gap, a negative gap. So to close this negative gap, we have to increase GDP by 500. Now close this gap of negative 500. To close this gap, we have to use expansionary fiscal policy. Expansionary fiscal policy is going to increase stuff that leads to increased spending in the economy and shift aggregate demand over here to the right, closing the gap, bringing us over here to point B. Now, we also know MPC is 0.8, which means MPS must be 1 minus 0.8, that must be 0.2. So now we can calculate both the spending multiplier and the taxes and transfer payment multiplier. Spending multiplier is 1 over MPS, which means 1 over 0.2, which gives us 5. Taxes and transfer payment multipliers, it's MPC over MPS, which means 0.8 over 0.2, that gives us 4. Now you can see here with the same numbers, we get a different multiplier, and the impact of the taxes and transfer payment multiplier is weaker than the spending multiplier, because when you're using spending, you're putting that money straight into the economy. But when you're changing taxes or transfer payments, then people have an extra step because they could either save money or spend money. So that's why it's a little bit less than the spending multiplier. So here we need a total change in GDP to close the gap of a $500 increase to close this gap right here. We're going to do 3 different ways to close it. First, we're going to look at changing spending. So since we're changing spending, we're going to use the spending multiplier, which is 5. And we're going to solve for this change in spending needed. So then you do the $500 gap divided by the multiplier. 5 gives you need a $100 increase in government spending to close the gap. If we were to do transfer payments, then we would use the transfer payment multiplier right here, which is 4 times the change in transfer payments needed. That's what we're solving for. So then you do the gap divided by the multiplier. That gives you need a $125 increase in transfer payments to close this gap. See how the amount is you need here is bigger than the amount in spending. That's because the multiplier for transfer payments is weaker than the spending multiplier. Finally, to change taxes, we're going to use the tax multiplier, which is 4, right here, times the taxes needed. That's what we're solving for. So then you do the gap, which is you need 500 to close the gap, divided by 4, because that's the multiplier. That means 125. But remember, to close this gap, you need expansionary fiscal policy, which is a decrease in taxes. So you need to decrease taxes by 125. That's all for this lesson. See you next time.